Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair is updating Canada's wildfire threats. Let's listen in live.
Patrolling communities that have been evacuated to ensure safety and adherence to mandatory evacuation orders, and they have been enforcing the no fire bans that have been put in place, particularly in the province of Nova Scotia. And finally, as well, Transport Canada is working with their provincial officials to better understand the needs and potential flexibility required in federal legislation. We've heard that from the province, asking for some flexibility, and Transport Canada is engaged with the province to make sure that we can get the job done together. The Canadian Coast Guard has response personnel and assets deployed to provide support to the province of Nova Scotia. They've deployed mobile incident command post trailers, crew support trailers, and they have 4 of their helicopters providing airlift and aerial surveillance. And Environment Canada continues to provide weather forecasting capabilities. And speaking of the weather forecast in the coming days, we have been advised that the cooler temperatures are moving in over the weekend into British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and quite hopefully, rain is expected in Nova Scotia today and tomorrow. This is good news, but it does not resolve a very difficult and dangerous situation. The situation remains severe across the country. We are hopeful that the improving weather conditions and that rain will assist in the firefighting efforts, but there's still a great deal of work that needs to be done. I want to assure Canadians that the federal government will continue to do whatever is necessary, working in partnership with the provinces, territories, and First Nations to ensure that Canadians can be kept safe and that we deal with what has been a very challenging start to our wildfire season. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. I will now turn it over to my colleague, the Parliamentary Secretary, Stéphane Lauzon, to speak to the situation that is beginning to emerge this morning in Quebec.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre. Vous avez, je tiens à réitérer vraiment l'empathie qu'on a envers tous les premiers répondants qu'on a à travers le Canada et à travers les pays.
Compassion and gratitude to first responders across the country.
Vous savez, cette aide-là est très bien reconnue.
The assistance has been greatly appreciated, and we really need it in order to get through this crisis. The situation in Quebec is increasing each day.
On a eu le dernier breuvage ce matin.
We had our latest briefing this morning.
On est impacté beaucoup à Sept-Îles. Aujourd'hui, il va y avoir des déplacements d'environ 10 000 personnes
about 10,000 people who will be moved from Sept-Îles.
Aux 500 résidences qui étaient à Chapet.
So the 500 residences in Chapet
où on a eu des évacuations. Et
were evacuated yesterday.
En compte à chaque heure parce qu'il y a une progression.
The situation is being taken into account at each hour because it is changing. There are about 100 forest fires and 20 of those under control, much more than yesterday and the day before. So the situation is changing in Quebec. As the minister said, we will be there to support and assist Quebec. But we are fully cooperating with our counterparts in Quebec so that requests are made efficiently through the province. I will be on site in Quebec shortly to talk about the situation and civilian safety situation. Thank you, everyone.
We'll take any questions you may have.
So, Minister Blair, just how many Canadian Forces members are on the ground right now? How many are you going to be deploying, and where within the province of Nova Scotia? We're talking about Nova Scotia here.
Yeah, no, talking about Nova Scotia, and as I think I mentioned to you yesterday, there's approximately 450 Canadian Armed Forces who are deployed out of Edmonton in Alberta. The Canadian Armed Forces work very closely with the Provincial Emergency Operations Centre, and our deployment of those resources is dependent entirely on what the province tells us they need on the ground. We know that some of those firefighters need training, and so that training is being provided over the next day or two. Some of that training will actually take place in New Brunswick, but there are a number of people, particularly in the 2nd Battalion in Nova Scotia, who are undertaking that training and making sure that they're properly kitted up to go and do the work that the province identifies that needs to be done. There's a number of duties that we have seen in Alberta that I think apply very aptly to the situation in Nova Scotia, where the Canadian Armed Forces as level 1 trained firefighters can go in, not necessarily on the front line of the burn, but that's where the existing firefighters are fighting this fire, but there's a lot of areas where there are hot spots where they've got to go in and do a significant amount of cleanup and to make sure that that fire doesn't reemerge in some of those places. But again, the deployment and the actual numbers, right now, and I know you want precise numbers, the Canadian Armed Forces has committed to provide what is required. They have not yet, as of this morning, provided me with a precise number, but adequate personnel will be deployed by the Canadian Armed Forces to provide the assistance that the province has requested and to do the work that the province seeks to have done by the Canadian Armed Forces.
So when will that happen? Because I know you have existing agreements right now with the Canadian Armed Forces. We have bases in Nova Scotia, but that additional person power, when are we going to see that?
Some of that person power has already been in place as a result of an MOU that existed. Some of it has already arrived in the operations center, and the Canadian Armed Forces has deployed logistics personnel into the ops center to work with the province. The province is ultimately responsible for the response. And we work very closely in support of them. They've asked for additional help. We've sent the Canadian Armed Forces. They're in the ops center today. And as well, the 2nd Battalion has deployed personnel for training and some logistics work to be prepared, and we're hopeful, and I fully expect that over the coming weekend that those resources will be made available to the province to assist in their response.
Si on regarde la situation au Québec, par exemple, qui semble s'empirer, est-ce que vous avez reçu une demande d'assistance de la part
Have you received a request for assistance from the Quebec government?
On aura les moyens de leur envoyer quelque chose alors qu'il y a
And will you have the
encore plein de
means
feux dans
to
d'autres
send
provinces
them
qui ont-
something, given what's going on in the other
Vous
provinces?
savez, il faut que la demande vienne de la province.
The request has to come
Nous, on est
from
là
the
en support.
province. We are there
On est en
primarily
pleine
as support.
collaboration au moment où on se parle. La dernière
We
fois,
are
je pense, ce matin,
collaborating,
on
and
est
we
en
gave a
communication,
briefing
on est
this
en train
morning.
de
We're in
regarder les
communication with the
demandes
province
initiales qui
and
sont
looking at
faites
initial
par Québec.
requests
C'est pas plus
being made
récent
by Quebec.
qu'une demi-heure passée. Là. On
The
parle.
most recent was a half hour
Bon,
ago.
les demandes sont en train d'être analysées par nos services. au
Requests
moment
are
où
being
on se parle.
analyzed by our services right now as we speak.
Effectivement, on va répondre au Québec comme on a
Indeed,
répondu
we
à
will
toutes les autres
respond
provinces.
to Quebec as we have done with all the other
C'est
provinces.
évident qu'en augmentant les feux de forêt un peu
Obviously,
partout, on a
as
des
forest
ressources
fires are
qui viennent de
increasing
l'Australie, on a des
everywhere,
ressources
we've
qui
got
viennent des
resources coming in
États-Unis, et
from
on va avoir des
Australia
ressources
and the
pour le
United
Québec
States,
aussi.
and we will have
Et, je
resources
crois
for
qu'on a
Quebec as
tellement
well.
de bons pompiers volontaires.
I think we have
des
so many
pompiers
good
qui sont,
volunteer
très bien
firefighters
formés.
who are
Il
very
s'agirait
well
simplement
trained.
de fournir les équipements nécessaires.
We just need to be able to
pour qu'on
provide the
puisse
equipment
envoyer des
necessary so that
pompiers,
we
très
could
bien
send
formés au
in
Québec pour aider le Québec.
trained firefighters to Quebec. So is
L'équipement
there a
l'équipement
request
va
for
toujours
equipment
être
then?
un enjeu important.
Equipment is always going to be a
L'équipement,
significant
on peut,
issue.
se l'approprier au fur et à mesure, et l'équipement
We can allocate it
nécessairement
as
est
needed,
un enjeu extrêmement important
But
pour
of
nos
course,
pompiers, pour leur
equipment is
sécurité,
very
puis pour
important for our
éteindre les feux.
firefighters
Donc,
and
c'est
their
sûr que ça va
safety.
rester un enjeu, mais on va tout faire
Of
en
course,
sorte
it's going to
qu'on
continue to
puisse
be an
s'entraider pour
issue,
arriver à
but
nos
we
fins
will
pour
do
fournir
whatever
les
we
équipements
can to make
nécessaires.
sure that we can help one another and provide the required equipment.
By the province of Quebec?
There's a number of equipment requests for 4x4 vehicles, et cetera. We are assisting the province of I'm sorry, was your question Quebec or Nova Scotia? Quebec. Oh, thank you very much. Listen, let me just, if I may just add, first of all, to the remarks of my parliamentary secretary. Quebec has a very robust and very experienced and capable emergency response capacity for dealing with wildfires. And they are quite well evolved in their response. But we're embedded with them, and we're working very closely. And Stefan and I spoke to our Government Operations Center today. They are in contact with Quebec. We're monitoring an emerging situation. And as there are a number, very significant, over 100 wildfires that have now popped up in Quebec, and some of them are out of control and quite serious. And in the Septilia region and everything else may even represent a threat to a community. And so we are working very closely and collaboratively with Quebec. But right now, Quebec has not asked for additional assistance, but in anticipation, and we've done this many times particularly with the province of Quebec, but in anticipation of what could be a very challenging wildfire season in every part of the country, and including Quebec, we've already begun a very close collaboration, and we're looking at not just what resources the federal government can bring forward, but also working very closely with the Canadian Interagency Firefighter Centre, which is CIFC, as we refer to it, to see what additional resources. You know, we have in many years past drawn upon upon CIFC to reach out to our international partners to bring people in, and so those discussions have already begun to see what resources could be made available and what might be required. And it's really just preparatory. At this point in time, we do not have a situation that in any way exceeds the capacity of the province of Quebec to respond. But we are anticipating, we have to be ready in case it does, and because there's also now, and I don't want to refer to this as a competition, but we have many fires in many parts of the country drawing upon a limited number of resources both within Canada and internationally, and so coordination.
Resources starting to be stretched thin.
Are they tapped out? We're seeing firefighters from New Zealand, Australia, the United States, and there aren't wildfires yet in the United States, for example. How stretched out are our personnel resources? And is some of the additional training, for example, all the money that's going to Indigenous training, did that come too late?
Well, and I would submit no. First of all, we have always been able, through the excellent work of the Canadian Interagency Firefighter Centre, been able to draw upon resources, because fires don't always happen in the same place in the country, and so we're able to move, for example, firefighting resources from one province to another, and there's a great deal of collaboration. CIFC is actually an organization which is a partnership between provinces, territories, and the federal government, and so there has been a long-standing collaboration and an ability to draw upon resources within the country, and that has worked very well for us and continues to work well for us. But in a situation where it exceeds the capacity of even the provinces to support each other, we've always also been able to rely on our international partners. And by the way, we send Canadian firefighters to the United States, to Australia, to Mexico, to New Zealand, and to other places to assist in their firefighting season as well. So it's a very collaborative effort. But in drawing upon those resources, we try to be as well prepared and preemptive as possible. And so we are looking at not only what we need today, which does not, I think it's a fairly significant draw upon those resources, but it's not unprecedented. We've done this many times in the past, but because of the significant extreme risk that we believe exists over the next 4 or 5 weeks, we just want to make sure that the resources are available. We're already doing that work to make sure that we've got them lined up.
You mentioned that there are more than a dozen fires that are specifically impacting Indigenous communities. What is the government doing to ensure that communities like Fort Chip, for example, who are being evacuated from their homes and facing real damage to their communities, what are you doing to ensure that these people are being supported and that their communities can be helped when they get back?
Thanks. I mean, it's a very important question. Indigenous Services Canada has its own emergency management response, and we have Indigenous Service Canada personnel working very closely with the leadership of those nations, including in Fort Chip. About 800 people, as I understand it, have had to be evacuated from those communities, and we assist both. It's a collaborative effort between the nation and the province and ourselves to ensure that evacuation is done in a way so people have, they have shelter, they have food, they have supporting services while the fire is being fought in their community. But we also have recognized, and through our national adaptation strategy and some of the investments Minister Wilkinson just announced yesterday, we know that we're going to need to train additional firefighter personnel, particularly Indigenous firefighting personnel, and we want to incorporate traditional knowledge into that training. And so we made an announcement that we're making significant new investments in that training and in their equipment so that those communities can be more resilient in the future.
Minister, I want to ask you about international fire.
You've been listening in to Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair updating us on Canada's wildfire threats.